area has over the past 15 to 20 years been passed around a variety of financial institutions and financial consortia. And these, some of these entities have used their control to extract fees and profits from refinancing of the operations of Thames Water. And at the same time, attempts to impose cost controls have meant that Thames Water has had a relatively poor record in environmental terms and has been subject recently to a record fine for its failure to control its sewage emissions effectively. The result of that is that Thames Water is now effectively bust. What being bust means in this context is quite complicated, partly because of the legislation and partly because what exactly the assets and liabilities of that institution are is a matter which is very likely to spend quite a lot of time being argued about in various courts. But the result of all this is that an industry of investment banks, lawyers and consultants has descended on Thames Water, and it appears raked in or acquired entitlements to quite extraordinary sums of money, certainly in the order of hundreds of millions of pounds from their advice, for what it is worth, on what should be done about this. And Thames Water now has a putative successor organisation called London and Valley Water. You will notice that the word Thames has disappeared, although London and Valley might give you a hint of the areas which this successor organisation, if it indeed comes into being, will cover. Because of course most people in this room either work for or represent organisations which are likely to be approached to provide financing for this organisation, which at present is no more than a shell company and may well turn out to be nothing more than a shell company, but what happens is then something to be determined. What Thames and, if you look at the London and Valley Water website, you will see that public relations consultants have certainly been among the people who have extracted these hundreds of millions of pounds from this activity. It's a very glossy site, and it will answer the question, or appear to answer the question, of what the purpose of markets is supposed to be. Because it emphasised in everything that London and Valley Water says that what is sought is a market-based, this phrase is very explicitly and repeatedly used, is a market-based solution to the supply of water to London. What that means is rather less clear, but it seems to me what the purpose of the supply of water to London is actually pretty clear. What London needs is clean water, reliably supplied. What it also means is its wastewater effectively disposed of. It needs these things to be done, the supply of fresh water and the removal of wastewater, with at least minimal environmental damage and ideally with environmental benefit. And it needs these things to be done as cheaply as is reasonably possible. And also, the organisation that controls these services needs to worry about the pay and conditions of its employees and about returns to people who provide the financing which is needed for it. There are multiple objectives to provision of water to London, as there are multiple objectives to any business activity. And the task of management in this and any other business is to find a balance between these objectives. Finding a balance in the case of Thames Water seem to me probably not particularly difficult. But there is a balance of objectives to be struck, and the words pluralism has been used several times in the course of this morning, and we need to come back to that, because it is in the nature of any business activity that its objectives are pluralist in the sense in which it was defined by Aristotle and by philosophers who've already been mentioned ever since. That is, striking that balance is what the job of management fundamentally is. And that is true for all businesses. In the case of Thames Water, or a water company, it seems, if one's honest, that the job of providing finance for this is relatively easy. The truth is, water is an activity for which there is a stable and predictable demand. The methods of supplying and disposing of wastewater have been actually known for a very long time, basically since the Romans did it 2,000 years ago. And they've not changed terribly much over the millennia since then. This is not a very difficult business to provide financing for. So it's quite hard at first sight to see why we need pay consultants several hundred million pounds to think of the answers to providing these problems. But that is a problem we have at the moment. And it disguises what we all know perfectly well is the real problem of Thames Water, which was the problems of control and management. Now, there are, of course, some people, quite a lot of people, who think that, the answer to that, this is that privatization was a mistake, and what we need to do is renationalize the water industry. People who think that have also, I think, been distracted by the headlines about Scotland versus Scotland in the World Cup and England versus Croatia and the like. They haven't been reading the recent report which has been published on HS2. They haven't been following what's going on at Hinkley Point. They haven't heard about bat tunnels and fish discos and the ways in which politics responds to almost any pressure by spending other people's money in large quantities to deal with it. And they also haven't been reading about what happened at the post office and the extent to which public management has been ready to cover up past failings, in this case in very extreme forms for a couple of decades. We have problems of management that are extensive in both public and private sector, and we have a group of industries and activities which we need to rethink our approach to in a fundamental way, of which water and railways are pretty good illustrations of these two. We have a report on the water industry by Sir John Cunliffe, whose background in the financial services industry, you will, I'm sure, agree, equips him well to pronounce on the appropriate regulatory structure for the water industry. The suggestion there is that what we need is a regulator, an Ofwat who has its remit extended beyond its existing economic functions into the quality of drinking water, the environmental implications and the like. And indeed, it would be a very good idea to have a body that had these kind of different expertises in drinking water, in economics, and undertook, as Cunliffe recommends, cost-benefit analysis of the trade-offs between these activities. It would be a good idea to have such a body, and it's perfectly obvious what, if we had such a body, it ought to be doing, which is running Thames Water and other companies. The idea that we set up a regulatory body that has all this expertise, and then we encourage people to make as much money as they can while satisfying the detailed regulations laid down by the regulator, seems obviously ludicrous, and would probably seem ludicrous to anyone who did not have a background in the way we run financial regulation for the last 30 or 40 years. We need to rethink this in a much more fundamental way. And the job of ethical finance, as I see it, or a central job of ethical finance, is to do precisely that. It is to use the control which finance helps to confer for these activities. It's to use that control to put in place effective management structures. I've treasured since 2008 now the remarks of one of the directors of one of the banks which failed in 2008, who said, the regulator should have prevented us from doing that. The regulator should not have prevented us from doing that. The board should have prevented them from doing that. And if the board did not prevent them doing that, the job of the regulator was to get another different board to do the proper job. And that is the way we need to be thinking about these kind of issues. We need boards which are engaged in this managed pluralism of the kind that Aristotle and Gray and others have been described. We need boards which are accomplished in this kind of pluralism, will supervise executive management in doing that, and if they don't, then we need to replace the boards, and that is the appropriate job for regulators, not to listen structure. We failed to do that job at Thames Water. And the notion that the answer to these problems is to bring in American hedge funds and private equity firms like KKR or Silver Partners and the like seems to me extraordinary. There are people, too many people, around in the financial world who think that their primary duty is to make money, in first instance for themselves, and secondarily for the organizations that they work for. I want to be quite clear, and I think almost everyone would want to be quite clear, that I don't want these people anywhere near the business of supplying me with water. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Fascinating words. And Eva, if I can welcome you up to stage as well while I do a few things.